The galactic survival simulation had a 90% failure rate. Cadets trembled as Commander Vex warned of psychological trauma that felt like real death. But one human cadet just calmly examined his fingernails. While aliens planned defensive strategies, Jake Morrison wandered off to pick berries and declared them excellent protein sources. His casual foraging would soon rewrite galactic survival doctrine. Commander Vex stood before the assembled cadets, his forearms clasped behind his back in perfect military posture. The holographic display behind him showed rotating schematics of Planet X7, each layer revealing progressively more terrifying environmental data. His voice carried the weight of centuries of command experience, measured and deliberate as he delivered statistics designed to systematically dismantle their confidence. This was the Death World survival simulation, the Academy's ultimate test of will and training. For 3 galactic standard weeks, these elite cadets would experience conditions that pushed species to their absolute limits. The planet's atmosphere contained trace neurotoxins that accumulated in the bloodstream. The native flora developed defense mechanisms that could induce paralysis or hallucinations. Even the rainfall carried acidic compounds that could eat through standard-issue uniforms within hours. The numbers flashed across the screen with cold precision. 90% failure rate, 70% of participants requiring psychological rehabilitation, the promise of trauma that felt indistinguishable from real death. Commander Vex watched as antennae drooped and scales flushed with anxiety throughout the room. These were the best graduates from 17 systems, now confronted with the reality that their extensive training might be completely inadequate. You could see the tension manifesting physically throughout the auditorium. Zara from the Rigel system kept adjusting her environmental suit's collar, her breathing apparatus clicking audibly with each nervous gesture. Blocks, the massive mineral-based life form from Cronus Prime, had begun emitting a low-frequency hum of distress that made the seats vibrate. Pip's large ocular sensors darted around the room as if calculating escape vectors, but one cadet remained utterly still amidst the growing unease. Human cadet. Jake Morrison sat with his legs crossed, his attention apparently focused on examining his own fingernails. He wasn't praying to any deity or engaging in panic suppression breathing techniques. He simply studied his hands with the calm focus of someone waiting for a bus, rather than preparing to be dropped onto a nightmare planet. This single image of mundane calm became the first crack in the simulation's terrifying facade. While others were mentally preparing for combat against the environment, Jake seemed to be regarding the entire exercise as a mildly interesting interruption to his day. The disconnect was so pronounced that several nearby cadets actually stopped their own anxiety rituals to stare at him. The briefing concluded with final instructions about emergency extraction protocols and psychological support services. The cadets filed out toward the transport bay, their movements stiff with apprehension. The dropships awaited, their hatches opening to reveal cramped seating and safety harnesses that looked more like restraint devices. Planet X7 filled the viewports as they approached, its swirling atmosphere presenting every shade of orange and red that typically indicated hostile conditions in galactic classification systems. The surface features included jagged mountain ranges that looked like broken glass and forests that appeared to move even from orbit. Every aspect had been carefully engineered to trigger maximum survival stress responses. The stage was now set for what should have been a total collapse of expectations and nerve. The simulation began with standard planetary insertion procedures, the ships breaking through the turbulent atmosphere with violent shaking that tested the integrity of every bolt and weld. Landing sequences initiated across multiple zones, each team hitting the ground with the jarring impact that characterized emergency deployment protocols. Alarm systems immediately began registering multiple environmental threats as hatches hissed open. So the simulation began, and everyone immediately did the wrong thing according to standard doctrine. They reached for weapons, activated defensive shields, and began scanning for immediate threats. Except Jake. He simply unbuckled his harness, stepped out onto the alien soil, and took a deep breath of the toxic air like he'd just arrived at a vacation destination. The landing bay doors sealed behind them with a definitive hiss, and immediately the alien cadets fell into their training protocols. Zara from Rigel activated her terrain scanner and began calculating optimal defensive positions, her voice tight with urgency as she suggested securing high ground on the nearby ridge. Blocks from Cronus Prime immediately inventoried their standard ration packs, and proposed a strict consumption schedule that would extend their supplies by precisely 3.2 days. Pip, the smallest of the group, started deploying perimeter sensors while urgently recommending they construct a fortified shelter before local sunset. Their movements were crisp, efficient, and born from centuries of Academy doctrine. Every action followed approved survival manuals, theoretical, supply-dependent approaches designed by instructors who had never actually set foot on a death world. You could see the fear driving their precision, the way their hands moved just a little too quickly, their vocal modulators pitched slightly higher than normal. They were preparing for a war against the environment, treating Planet X7 as an enemy to be defeated through superior technology and disciplined resource management. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison simply walked away from the group. He didn't bother with scanners or defensive protocols. Instead, he moved toward a cluster of vegetation that pulsed with an ominous violet light, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. The other cadets watched his departure with growing alarm, their training screaming that wandering off alone on an unknown planet represented the most fundamental violation of survival protocol. He approached a bush covered in strange, throbbing berries that emitted a faint bioluminescent glow. The berries visibly contracted when he got near them, a defensive mechanism that made Zara gasp and reach for her sidearm. Their academy training specifically warned about pulsating flora, usually indicated either toxic properties or predatory camouflage. Jake didn't draw a weapon. He leaned forward and gave the berries a casual sniff, like someone checking the ripeness of fruit at a market. The other cadets held their breath, expecting some kind of violent reaction, toxic spores, snapping tendrils, anything that would confirm their training. He plucked one of the glowing berries and popped it into his mouth. The entire team flinched. Pip actually ducked behind Blox's mineral-based form. They waited for the convulsions, the paralysis, the certain death that Academy survival videos had shown them in graphic detail. Jake chewed thoughtfully. Tart with kind of a nutty aftertaste. Not bad, he wasn't choking or dissolving. He was just tasting, as if he'd sampled a new flavor of candy rather than a potentially lethal alien organism. Then he turned to the stunned group and delivered the line that would begin rewriting their entire understanding of survival. These have an excellent protein content. We should harvest these before they go out of season. In that moment, the death world transformed. It wasn't a combat zone anymore, it was a pantry. The terrifying pulsating berries became ingredients. The environment shifted from enemy to resource. Jake continued walking, leaving the other cadets standing there with their scanners and ration plans and defensive protocols. They watched him examine a nearby stream, then study some hanging vines, then kneel to examine some fungal growths at the base of a tree. Every movement was methodical but relaxed, the opposite of their tense, combat-ready stances. Their academy training had taught them to see threats. Jake was seeing possibilities. Where they saw danger, he saw dinner. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that for several minutes nobody moved or spoke. They just watched the human treat a Class 7 death world like it was his backyard garden. Then he kept walking, following what appeared to be an animal trail, completely unconcerned about ambushes or predators. The baffled aliens remained at the landing site, their carefully laid plans suddenly feeling inadequate and strangely theoretical. While the other cadets struggled with their Academy-issue shelter modules, wrestling with malfunctioning magnetic seals and confusing assembly diagrams, Jake simply wandered off to gather sticks. The prefab gear represented the pinnacle of galactic engineering, self-erecting structures with climate control and energy shielding. They were also currently failing to deploy properly on Planet X7's unfamiliar magnetic field, leaving Zara cursing softly in her native tongue as she tried to force the components together. The alien cadets assumed Jake was building a basic, primitive lean-to, the kind of temporary shelter their instructors had briefly mentioned as a last resort option. They watched with a mixture of pity and confusion as he selected specific types of branches, testing their flexibility by bending them against his knee. His movements seemed almost artistic rather than practical, like someone weaving a basket instead of constructing a defensive fortification. He worked without urgency, humming quietly to himself as he arranged the framework. The tension grew as his construction took shape. It looked nothing like the geometric precision of Academy designs. The walls curved naturally, following the contours of the land rather than fighting against them. He used fibers from a local plant to lash the structure together, creating a weave so tight that when the first acidic rain began to fall, the water beat it up and rolled off the surface instead of soaking through. The cadets stared as their high-tech shelter covers began, sizzling under the corrosive droplets while Jake's stick-and-fiber creation remained completely dry. He then dug a shallow trench around the perimeter with a flat stone, creating a drainage system that channeled water away from the sleeping area. The simple earthwork prevented flooding with an efficiency that rivaled their powered moisture control systems. Blocks watched with particular interest, his mineral-based form shifting slightly as he processed the elegant simplicity of the solution. Then Jake did something that made Pip's ocular sensors widen in disbelief. He collected broad, waxy leaves and flexible vines, weaving them into a series of overlapping panels that he hung in the doorway. As the day's heat intensified, the leaves began to move slightly, catching the breeze and creating a passive cooling effect that lowered the interior temperature by several degrees. It was a rudimentary air conditioning system made entirely from materials he'd gathered within 50 meters of their landing site. The completed shelter represented a perfect blend of rustic improvisation and shockingly effective engineering. It required no power source, no spare parts, and almost zero reliance on their dwindling academy supplies. While the others were already worrying about battery conservation and equipment failure, Jake had built something that would function indefinitely using only what the environment provided. The resolution dawned on them slowly, then all at once. This wasn't just random bushcraft. Zara finally thought to access Jake's academy file and discovered his literature degree included a minor in outdoor recreation. The defensive planner, Blocks, who had topped his class in structural engineering and tactical fortification, found himself taking notes on leaf-weaving techniques from a poet. The hierarchy of useful knowledge had just been completely inverted, so the cadet with the most advanced technical training found himself watching a literature major build a better shelter using sticks and vines. Block's massive hands, designed for operating heavy machinery, now clumsily attempted to mimic Jake's weaving technique. The entire concept of what constituted advanced survival training was being rewritten right before their eyes, one carefully placed branch at a time. Jake paused beside a cluster of mushrooms that pulsed with ominous orange and black patterns. He pointed casually like someone indicating where they'd left their keys. "That one's lunch," he announced as if commenting on the weather. The alien cadets recoiled in unison. Their scanners immediately lit up with frantic warnings. Zara's device projected holographic readouts, showing neurotoxins capable of paralyzing their respiratory systems. Blocks's mineral-based skin actually changed color in reaction to the detected digestive inhibitors that could shut down entire metabolic processes. Pip's multispectral vision identified a cocktail of 17 distinct lethal compounds, each more terrifying than the last. The mushrooms weren't just poisonous, they were comprehensively, professionally deadly. Their training screamed at them through years of academy conditioning. The protocols were clear and absolute. Avoid all unidentified flora. Eliminate anything that registers above threat level 3. Their survival literally depended on following these rules without deviation. Centuries of Deathworld survival doctrine had been built around this fundamental principle. If it might kill you, you either avoid it or destroy it. Jake simply pulled a small knife from his belt and began demonstrating. "Toxicity is usually about concentration and processing method," he explained, his tone as matter-of-fact as someone reading cooking instructions. He made a precise cut at the stem's base, avoiding the spore-producing cap entirely. "You never want the gills, that's where they concentrate the defensive compounds." He carried the mushrooms to the stream they'd found earlier and began washing them with deliberate motions. "A good soak in running water helps leach out the water-soluble toxins," he continued, his hands moving with practiced ease. "Then we'll need to boil them for at least 20 minutes. The heat breaks down the protein-based inhibitors." The cadets watched in stunned silence as he talked about dosage thresholds and preparation techniques. He discussed neutralizers like someone listing ingredients for a recipe, mentioning how certain minerals in the local water would help bind with residual toxins. What their scanners had identified as certain death became, in Jake's explanation, merely a matter of proper kitchen technique. To the aliens, this wasn't food preparation. It was alchemy. They were watching someone transform lethal compounds into edible nutrients through what seemed like mystical knowledge. Their technology could identify the poisons, but couldn't conceive of making them safe. Jake's approach treated toxicity not as an absolute barrier, but as a culinary challenge to be solved. The resolution dawned on them, slowly as the mushrooms simmered in a makeshift pot Jake had fashioned from a hollow stone. Human bodies had evolved on a world where dinner often fought back chemically. Their digestive systems developed into sophisticated biochemical processing plants, capable of handling variable toxin loads. More importantly, their culture had developed methods to make dangerous foods safe through centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations. Jake ladled the steaming mushrooms into makeshift bowls he'd carved from tree bark. The broth smelled surprisingly earthy and rich, with a herbal note from some leaves he'd added during cooking. The alien cadets hesitated, their training still screaming warnings at them. Their scanners continued to show residual toxin levels that should have been concerning. Zara took the first tentative sip. Then a larger mouthful. Blocks followed, his mineral composition actually seeming to brighten slightly at the taste. Pip watched them for a moment before trying it herself. They ate the entire serving, their movements gradually losing the tense hesitation they'd shown initially. Nobody died. Nobody got sick. The meal was not only safe but actually satisfying, providing nutrients their ration packs had been designed to supply through synthetic means. They'd just consumed what their instruments had classified as lethal biological weapons, transformed into dinner by a literature student with a pocket knife and some basic cooking knowledge. The galactic definition of edible had just expanded dramatically. Their understanding of survival shifted from avoidance to transformation. They weren't just learning to survive the death world. They were learning how to make it work for them. High above the swirling orange atmosphere of Planet X7, in a climate-controlled observation room that smelled of recycled air and anxiety, a xenobiology officer named Crick stared at his monitor with all four of his eyes blinking at different intervals. His mandibles clicked softly in confusion as he scrolled through the incoming data streams. The screens showed vital signs, environmental readings, and resource utilization metrics from the simulation below. None of it made sense according to the established parameters. The simulation was specifically calibrated to test cadets against a Class 7 Death World environment. The planet's specifications included atmospheric toxins, aggressive flora and fauna, and resource scarcity designed to push survival training to its absolute limits. The expected data patterns showed gradual resource depletion, rising stress biomarkers, and increasingly desperate survival measures. That's what the other teams displayed. Their readings followed the predicted curves of deterioration almost perfectly, but one data stream refused to conform. The human cadet's metrics showed not just survival, but actual improvement over time. His stress levels had dropped after the first few hours. His nutritional markers were optimal despite not touching his ration packs. Most baffling of all, his environmental adaptation rates were logging numbers that the system initially flagged as sensor errors. Crix watched as the human constructed shelters using methods not found in any Academy database, harvested and processed food sources that should have been lethal, and moved through dangerous territory with what appeared to be casual indifference to established threat profiles. Crix pulled up Earth's planetary file, expecting to find some kind of explanation. The classification read Class 5, moderate toxicity, manageable climate variations, mostly docile life forms. A perfectly average planet that should have produced a perfectly average cadet. The file included notes about Earth's diverse ecosystems and tendency toward extreme weather patterns, but nothing that would explain the data. Streaming from Planet X7. The officer's antennae twitched as he compared the official classification with what he was observing in real time. The discrepancy wasn't just noticeable, it was catastrophic. Either the sensors were malfunctioning across multiple systems simultaneously, or the galactic planetary classification system had made a fundamental error about an entire world. Crix began inputting the observed data points into the recalibration algorithm. He entered the humans' demonstrated toxin tolerance levels, which exceeded documented Class 7 parameters by 300%. He logged the environmental adaptation rates that showed near instantaneous adjustment to extreme conditions. He added the predatory evasion techniques that seemed less like trained responses and more like instinctual reactions. The classification algorithm processed the new inputs with a low hum that echoed through the observation room. Crix watched the progress bar fill, his primary hands resting nervously on the console. The system compared the new data against centuries of Deathworld research, cross-referencing biological capabilities with environmental challenges. It should have been impossible. Planets don't just jump classification levels. The entire galactic scale was built on gradual gradients and careful scientific consensus. The console chimed softly as the calculation completed. The new designation flashed on the screen in bold red letters usually reserved for system-wide emergencies. Class 12. The number seemed to vibrate with implications. Class 12 worlds were theoretical constructs, nightmare scenarios used in academic papers about the absolute limits of survivability. They existed as mathematical possibilities rather than actual places. The classification came with automatic alerts to every xenobiology department in the sector, and triggered a mandatory review of all previous contact protocols involving that species. Crix sat back in his chair, his carapace making a faint cracking sound from the tension. Earth was now officially a Class 12 death world, the first planetary designation to ever receive such a drastic upward revision. The file automatically updated across the network, instantly changing humanity's standing in every galactic database. Travel advisories would be rewritten, diplomatic protocols revised, and scientific understanding of biological adaptability would require complete reassessment. The Academy's understanding of the universe had just become significantly more dangerous, and it had all started because one human cadet decided to make mushroom stew instead of following standard survival protocols. Crix glanced at the monitor showing Jake calmly instructing the other cadets on proper berry identification techniques, completely unaware that he'd just rewritten galactic science. The officer made a note to request hazard. Pay for anyone assigned to Earth-related research going forward. What began as a simple shelter had transformed into a full-field kitchen operation that would make any professional chef nod with approval. The basic lean-to now functioned as the central hub of a surprisingly sophisticated culinary setup. A clever water collection system using broad leaves and hollow vines channeled morning condensation into storage containers fashioned from natural materials. Nearby sat a cooking pit lined with heat-retaining stones that Jake had selected for their specific thermal properties, allowing him to maintain consistent temperatures for different cooking methods. Above this hung drying racks woven from flexible branches, preserving excess food through careful air circulation rather than energy-intensive dehydration units. The alien cadets watched this evolution with a mixture of confusion and growing appreciation. They were no longer merely surviving on ration bars and emergency supplies. They were being served actual meals that varied in flavor and texture. Jake had established a clear operational sequence that governed their days. Harvesting happened in the early morning when plants were most hydrated and nutrients were most concentrated. Processing occurred before noon, involving cleaning, cutting, and preliminary treatments to neutralize toxins. Cooking finished before dusk, utilizing the remaining daylight and cooler evening temperatures for more comfortable meal preparation. He explained this rhythm to them while stirring a pot of simmering roots. Morning harvest captures the best nutritional content, he noted, his attention divided between the pot and the surrounding vegetation. Processing during daylight ensures we can see what we're doing properly. Evening cooking means we eat while the food's still hot but don't waste daylight hours just preparing meals. His commentary extended to flavor, combinations that seemed absurdly sophisticated for a survival scenario. He pointed out plants whose sharp acidity balanced the richness of certain fungi. He identified herbs that added complexity to otherwise bland tubers. All these components came from within a 100-meter radius of their camp, transforming what appeared to be random vegetation into a coordinated pantry. This wasn't desperation cooking. It was disciplined, systematic food preparation approached with the precision of military logistics. Jake treated meal preparation as a form of practical warfare against the environment's inherent challenges. Where the death world presented defensive mechanisms, toxins, thorns, irritants, he saw culinary puzzles to be solved through technique and timing. A plant that released paralyzing compounds when touched raw became, after proper processing, a flavorful thickener for stews. A berry that caused digestive distress if eaten directly transformed into a preservative agent when dried and ground. The most telling moment came when Zara, who had been the most cautious and protocol-conscious cadet from the beginning, accepted a bowl of stew from Jake. She hesitated for only a moment before tasting it, her antennae twitching slightly as she processed the flavors. Then she looked at Jake with what might have been the first genuinely relaxed expression any of them had shown since landing. "This is actually good. Thanks," she said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. The simulation's greatest threat, the environment's constant pressure toward starvation and desperation, was being systematically defeated not through force or technology, but through technique and timing, led by someone who approached survival as a cooking challenge. The alien cadets found themselves well-fed, hydrated, and even enjoying meals, while other teams following standard protocols were struggling with rationing and hunger. Meanwhile, in the observation deck high above, the Academy staff was experiencing something approaching professional vertigo. They watched Jake's culinary operations with a mixture of awe and horror, their screens showing nutritional levels that exceeded optimal parameters, while their manuals contained no protocols for what they were witnessing. The very premise of the exercise, that survival meant enduring hardship and scarcity, was being methodically dismantled by a human who treated a death world like his personal kitchen garden. Their carefully constructed simulation was being conquered not with weapons or technology, but with cooking techniques that wouldn't have seemed out of place in a rural Earth kitchen. Back at the Academy, the reclassification of Earth wasn't a one-time administrative adjustment. It became a cascade of bureaucratic revisions that spread through multiple departments like a particularly stubborn software glitch. Each new transmission from the simulation revealed another layer of human absurdity that forced specialists to reconsider basic assumptions about biological limits and environmental adaptability. The xenobiology department found itself working triple shifts just to process the incoming data, their standard classification models crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence. Earth's weather patterns received their own special designation after analysts reviewed footage of tornadoes, hurricanes, and seasonal temperature swings that could vary by 60 degrees within the same region. The classification team settled on criminally aggressive as the most accurate descriptor, noting that most species would consider such atmospheric volatility grounds for planetary evacuation. The Meteorological Division began compiling a supplemental guide specifically for Earth conditions, with special emphasis on what to do when the sky suddenly turns green or precipitation transforms from liquid to solid without warning. Xenobiology hazard pay for Earth-related assignments tripled overnight once the full implications of the reclassification sank in. Field researchers who had previously considered a Class 5 assignment mildly challenging now demanded additional hazardous environment supplements and psychological risk compensation. The accounting department processed 17 separate union grievances within the first rotation cycle, all citing the New Earth designation as justification for revised compensation packages. Therapists specializing in death world trauma found themselves placed on high alert, their schedules suddenly filled with preemptive counseling sessions for staff scheduled to have any contact with Earth or its inhabitants. The waiting lists grew as personnel who had previously interacted with humans began questioning whether they might have sustained undiagnosed psychological damage from the exposure. The medical wing started stockpiling anti-anxiety medications and expanding their therapy drone fleet in anticipation of increased demand. Then the other shoe dropped. Another data update arrived from the simulation, this time containing footage of Jake calmly harvesting plants that actively tried to sting him, while simultaneously explaining their culinary uses to terrified cadets. The analysis algorithms processed the new information. The humans demonstrated resistance to neurotoxins, his casual handling of predatory flora, his apparent immunity to psychological stress in life-threatening situations. The system recalculated Earth's classification yet again, the numbers climbing past previous theoretical limits. The resolution appeared on screens across the Academy with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. Earth was now officially a Class 15 death world, a designation that had previously existed only as a mathematical extreme in theoretical xenology papers. The number represented such absolute environmental hostility that most species wouldn't survive 24 hours without full protective gear and constant medical support. The bureaucrats processing the paperwork, in a fit of dark humor that would eventually become departmental legend, began referring to the new measurement as the Morrison scale in their internal communications. So a literature student's name became the new galactic standard for measuring planetary horror, his casual competence rewriting centuries of scientific understanding. Across the academy, instructors found themselves referring to Morrison-level adaptation and Morrison-range toxicity tolerance, as if these were established technical terms rather than concepts that had literally not existed a week earlier. The scale would eventually be formalized with official documentation, but its origins would always remain tied to that one human cadet's performance. And Jake, completely unaware that he'd become a unit of measurement for galactic danger, was just back at camp teaching everyone how to bake bread in a hot spring. He'd found a thermal vent with perfect steady temperature control and was demonstrating how to wrap dough in large leaves for steam baking. The alien cadets watched with focused attention, their earlier fears replaced by practical curiosity about carbohydrate development in hydrothermal environments. They'd stopped seeing Planet X7 as a death world and started seeing it as a poorly stocked but workable kitchen, which was perhaps the most terrifying adaptation of all from the Academy's perspective. Pip watched Jake construct the solar still with growing fascination. The device used nothing but broad leaves, a depression in the ground, some rocks, and a collection container fashioned from a hollowed-out fruit. As water droplets began collecting in the container through simple condensation, Pip's curiosity finally overcame her caution. She gestured toward the working still with one delicate appendage, her voice carrying the respectful tone the cadets had begun using when asking Jake about his methods. "Where did you learn to build something like this? Was there an advanced survival manual from your military? Some specialized Earth training program?" The other cadets leaned in slightly, their interest palpable. They expected Jake to name some elite Earth institution or secret government program. Their own training came from centuries of carefully vetted academy materials, certified instructors, and approved techniques that had undergone rigorous testing. They imagined Earth must have something similar, only more intense given their planetary classification. Jake finished adjusting a leaf to improve the condensation surface and shrugged. "I think I saw it on a YouTube video once." He said it with the same casual tone someone might use to recall where they'd left their keys. The word meant nothing to them. YouTube. The cadets exchanged confused glances, their translation implants failing to provide context for the term. Zara ventured the first guess. "Is this YouTube an advanced Earth data network? Some kind of restricted access information system for survival specialists?" Jake laughed softly as he checked the water collection rate. "No, it's just this website where people post videos. Anyone can upload anything, really." He explained it as if describing something completely mundane rather than revolutionary. You've got experts showing proper techniques, but also just regular people sharing what they know. Weekend campers, hobbyists, kids doing school projects. It's all there if you know how to search for it. The concept baffled them completely. A global open-source network where survival knowledge wasn't controlled, certified, or regulated, where information from untrained enthusiasts existed alongside professional demonstrations. Their entire academic structure was built on centralized, top-down information distribution. Knowledge flowed from experts to students through approved channels after thorough verification. The idea that vital survival techniques might be learned from some anonymous person's homemade video seemed simultaneously revolutionary and terrifying. Jake continued explaining as he worked, completely unaware of the cognitive dissonance he was creating. "I learned knife skills from a chef's channel, shelter building from a guy who camps every weekend, plant identification from this woman who does foraging walks in her local park." He listed the sources, as if they were completely normal rather than representing a fundamentally different approach to knowledge acquisition. To Jake, YouTube was just part of life, a chaotic digital library where information flowed freely without gatekeepers or quality control. To the Academy cadets, it represented a knowledge ecosystem so informal it bordered on recklessness. They tried to imagine their own instructors allowing them to learn critical survival skills from unvetted sources, from people without proper credentials or certification. The very concept challenged their understanding of how important information should be handled. The resolution settled over them slowly. Jake's expertise didn't come from some superior Earth training program. It came from a vast, uncontrolled repository where a fourth grader's science project might appear, alongside a special forces demonstration, where professional knowledge mixed with amateur experimentation in a completely unstructured way. The Academy's first real lesson from Earth wasn't about survival techniques themselves, but about how humans approached learning survival. Their entire methodology for knowledge transmission, careful, controlled, and centralized, stood in stark contrast to Earth's messy, democratic everyone teaches everyone approach. So the cadets who had been trained to trust only certified experts found themselves learning from someone whose knowledge came from a platform where cat videos and survival tutorials existed side by side. Pip looked at the solar still, then at Jake, then at the surrounding death world that had become their classroom. The most advanced survival technique they'd learned so far had been acquired by a human watching videos made by random strangers on the internet. The hierarchy of knowledge authority had just been completely upended. Commander Vex watched the simulation feed with a growing sense of professional vertigo. His four hands rested on the observation console, but his attention was completely focused on the screen showing Jake Morrison calmly demonstrating how to weave waterproof mats from reeds. For centuries, Vex had built his career on certain fundamental truths about survival. It required discipline, control, and a healthy fear of the unknown. His entire philosophy centered on the concept that preparation meant anticipating worst-case scenarios and developing protocols to mitigate them. The Academy's training reflected this approach, structured, systematic, and based on the premise that the universe was fundamentally hostile. This human cadet was systematically dismantling that entire worldview. Jake treated the unknown not as something to be feared, but as a slightly challenging weekend project. He approached lethal plants with the curiosity of a chef examining new ingredients. He built shelters with the creative problem-solving of someone assembling furniture without instructions. His entire demeanor suggested that survival wasn't a battle to be won, but a puzzle to be solved, and he seemed to be enjoying the process. The tension built in Vex's carapace as he watched Jake laugh at something. Pip said while stirring a pot of something that had registered as highly toxic on their scanners just hours earlier. Vex realized this wasn't some anomalous behavior from a single exceptional human. The pattern suggested something far more significant. This might represent a teachable, transferable skill set. The way Jake explained concepts broke down processes into manageable steps and adapted techniques to available materials indicated a methodology that could be learned rather than some innate biological advantage. The other cadets were already beginning to emulate his approaches, their movements losing the rigid precision of academy training and gaining the fluid adaptability that characterized Jake's methods. The commander contemplated the unthinkable. Reaching out directly to Earth's command would require bypassing centuries of established diplomatic protocols. First contact procedures were designed around cautious, gradual information exchange, not sudden requests for survival tutoring. It would mean admitting that the galaxy's premier military academy needed help with its core curriculum from a species that had only recently been classified as a potential threat. The bureaucratic implications alone would require a complete overhaul of interstellar relations frameworks. Vex made his decision with the quiet certainty that had defined his career. He turned to his communications officer and directed the team to draft a formal proposal for a cultural exchange program. The document would need to frame the request in terms that wouldn't completely undermine galactic security protocols, while still conveying the urgent need for Earth's particular expertise. The resolution took shape in the careful wording of the proposal, which avoided mentioning that their interest stemmed from watching one cadet outperform their entire training system. So the most powerful military force in the sector found itself preparing to ask for help from a planet where children learned these skills in 4th grade. The irony wasn't lost on Vex as he reviewed the draft communication. Their advanced technology, their centuries of research, their carefully developed protocols. All of it had been surpassed by what amounted to recreational knowledge from a species they'd previously considered moderately advanced at best. The request itself became an exercise in diplomatic nuance, carefully avoiding any mention of their actual motivations. The final message was simple, deliberately understated, and completely misleading about its actual purpose. Tell them we're very interested in learning more about their weekend camping activities, Vex instructed, his mandibles clicking softly at the absurdity of the situation. The communication would be sent through proper diplomatic channels, but its content would baffle Earth's officials, who would have no context for why the galaxy's foremost military power suddenly wanted information about recreational outdoor practices. The exchange program proposal made no mention of Death World survival or planetary reclassification, focusing instead on cultural sharing and educational cooperation, all while secretly hoping to learn how to make stew from poisonous mushrooms. The Academy's formal inquiry reached Earth through proper diplomatic channels, packaged with the appropriate level of encryption and accompanied by the sort of bureaucratic language that typically precedes requests for sensitive information. The transmission contained carefully worded questions about Earth's survival training methodologies, framed as cultural exchange interest rather than the desperate need for educational reform it actually represented. The Academy's Intelligence Division had prepared for multiple response scenarios, each requiring different levels of analysis and security handling. They expected classified military survival manuals filled with technical specifications and advanced scientific data. Their analysts were prepared to decode complex documents detailing specialized training programs, possibly with accompanying videos showing elite forces demonstrating extreme environment techniques. The anticipation built around what secrets Earth might reveal about their apparently superior survival methods. Would it involve advanced biotechnology, secret genetic enhancements, revolutionary equipment designs? What arrived in response was a single digital file titled Standard 4th Grade Outdoor Education Requirements. The document lacked encryption, used basic formatting, and opened with a cheerful illustration of children smiling while building a stick fort. The Academy's analysts initially suspected some kind of diplomatic misdirection or translation error. They ran the file through multiple verification protocols, convinced this must be cover for more sensitive information hidden within the data stream. The tension grew as they examined the actual content. The document outlined skills that Earth considered appropriate for 9 and 10-year-olds. It included sections on identifying edible plants with simple line drawings of common species. There were step-by-step instructions for building shelters using natural materials, complete with child-friendly diagrams showing how to weave branches together. Water purification methods were explained with clear illustrations of rock filters and solar stills that looked suspiciously similar to what Jake had built on Planet X7. The language throughout was simple and direct, written for comprehension at an elementary school level. Complex concepts were broken down into basic steps with memorable phrases and easy-to-follow sequences. The technical terminology that filled Academy manuals was completely absent, replaced by plain descriptions that any child could understand. Safety precautions were presented as simple rules rather than complex risk assessment protocols. The appendix offered what it called advanced materials for optional study, suggesting that the core content represented merely the beginner level expected of all students. These supplemental sections included more detailed plant identification guides, shelter variations for different environments, and additional water collection methods. The implication was clear. This wasn't specialized knowledge reserved for elites. This was considered basic, universal education for Earth's children. The resolution settled over the analysis team with gradually dawning horror. The galaxy's most advanced survival academy, with its centuries of research and sophisticated training programs, had been completely humbled by what amounted to an elementary school homework assignment. Their entire curriculum, which produced cadets who trembled at the thought of Planet X7, was being surpassed by knowledge Earth expected 4th graders to master. So Earth's definition of basic survival education aligned almost perfectly with the Academy's definition of elite specialist training. The skills that Jake had demonstrated, the shelter construction, the plant identification, the water purification, weren't exceptional by Earth standards. They were the minimum requirements for children completing their primary education. The document suggested that students who mastered these skills would receive satisfactory grades and move on to learn other subjects. And Jake Morrison, whose performance had triggered the planetary reclassification and forced the Academy to reconsider its entire approach to survival training, had apparently been just a B-plus student in this system. His file showed solid but unremarkable grades in outdoor education, with teacher comments noting he sometimes struggled with knot-tying techniques but showed creativity in shelter design. The human who had rewritten Galactic understanding of survival capability had been, by Earth standards, moderately competent at best. The realization forced a complete reassessment of what humanity's best practitioners might be capable of achieving. The alien cadets finally gathered the courage to ask the question they'd been avoiding since the first day. They found Jake carefully arranging stones around their cooking fire, his movements deliberate but relaxed. Zara took the lead, her antennae twitching with a mixture of curiosity and professional frustration. "Your methods are effective," she began, choosing her words with diplomatic care. "We were wondering about your formal training background. Which advanced xenobotany program did you attend? Or was it exogeology?" They'd prepared themselves for a complex answer involving specialized earth sciences they'd never encountered. Their imaginations had conjured images of secret academic institutions where humans studied survival as an advanced discipline, perhaps with access to proprietary research about extreme environments. Blocks had even speculated about hidden genetic enhancements that might explain Jake's apparent immunity to planetary stressors. Jake finished arranging the stones before looking up, his expression mildly surprised by the question. "Oh, my degree is in literature," he said, as if stating something completely ordinary. "I minored in outdoor recreation." He picked up a long stick to adjust the fire, completely missing the stunned silence that followed his statement. The cadets exchanged bewildered glances. Literature. The word translated poorly through their implants, suggesting something about written artistic expression rather than practical survival skills. Pip ventured the next logical question, her voice barely above a whisper. "And your thesis? What specialized research did you conduct?" Jake smiled slightly, poking at the fire. "Cosmic themes in 20th century poetry. How space exploration influenced metaphorical language in the post-war period." He said it with the casual pride of someone discussing a mildly interesting school project, rather than the foundation of his apparently extraordinary capabilities. The tension in the air became almost physical. These cadets had spent their entire academic careers training for survival scenarios. They'd studied advanced physics, engineering, xenobiology, and tactical theory. Their education had been specifically designed to prepare them for exactly this kind of challenge. Yet here was a human who had apparently focused on analyzing ancient Earth poetry, outperforming them all. Jake continued, completely unaware of the cognitive dissonance he was creating. The practical stuff just came from family camping trips and a part-time job at a state park back home. He described weekend outings with his parents, learning to identify plants and build fires. He mentioned working as a park ranger assistant during university summers, leading nature walks and maintaining trails. To him, these were ordinary experiences, not specialized training. His perspective on survival emerged slowly through his explanations. He didn't see the environment as a collection of threats to be neutralized or avoided. He described it as a story to be read, a text filled with clues and patterns waiting to be interpreted. The way vines grew indicated water sources, animal trails suggested safe passage routes, plant coloration hinted at soil composition and sunlight patterns. Where the cadets saw danger, he saw narrative. The resolution settled over them like a sudden temperature drop. Jake's power wasn't brute force knowledge or superior technology. It was an interpretive, creative approach to problem solving that treated survival as a collaborative process with the environment rather than a battle against it. His literature background hadn't been irrelevant. It had taught him how to read subtle patterns and find meaning in complexity. His minor in outdoor recreation had provided the practical application methods, so the poet understood the death world better than the soldiers because he approached it with curiosity rather than fear. He listened to what the environment was telling him instead of trying to impose his will upon it. The patterns of growth, the behavior of animals, the flow of water all became pieces of a story he was learning to read rather than problems he needed to solve through force or technology. And the simulation they had all approached as the ultimate test of their combat training and survival protocols had never been a test at all, at least not in the way they'd understood it. It was a narrative, and Jake had been its author from the moment he decided to treat a death world as his kitchen garden. The alien cadets had been trying to pass an exam while Jake had been writing a completely different story, one where survival meant adaptation rather than conquest, where the environment became a partner rather than an opponent. The mood in the observation deck shifted from professional curiosity to full-blown institutional panic. What had begun as an interesting anomaly had become a cascading systems failure that threatened the Academy's entire operational foundation. Officer Crix delivered his report with all four hands trembling slightly, his usually steady voice pitched higher than normal. His screens showed multiple warning indicators flashing across different departments simultaneously, each representing another piece of their carefully constructed survival doctrine, collapsing under the weight of Jake Morrison's unexpected competence. Textbooks that had taken generations to compile were suddenly obsolete. Every chapter on flora identification needed complete revision after Jake demonstrated that half the lethal plants could be safely eaten with proper preparation. Training simulations built around resource scarcity became irrelevant when the humans showed how to harvest abundance from what scanners had classified as barren terrain. Instructors found themselves completely unprepared to answer cadets questions about techniques that didn't appear in any approved curriculum. The psychology department projected therapy needs would increase by 400%. Cadets who discovered their extensive training had been fundamentally wrong about basic survival principles were experiencing something between professional disillusionment and existential crisis. The medical wing began preparing for waves of anxiety disorders, stemming from the realization that their most cherished survival protocols might actually decrease their chances of staying alive on hostile worlds. Atmospheric classification charts were being rewritten in real time as analysts struggled to reconcile Earth's new death world status with the humans' casual treatment of extreme environments. Planets that had been considered manageable were suddenly being flagged for reevaluation using the new Morrison scale parameters. The cartography department actually requested emergency funding to remap half their surveyed systems using revised threat assessment algorithms. The very foundation of their survival doctrine was crumbling into dust. Centuries of carefully developed knowledge, tested theories, and proven methodologies were proving inadequate against a literature major with a pocket knife and some basic camping experience. The panic spread through the observation deck like a low-grade electrical current, making antennae twitch and carapaces click with nervous energy. Specialists argued over data interpretations. Technicians ran frantic diagnostics on their equipment, and administrators calculated the bureaucratic nightmare of revising every training manual simultaneously. Commander Vex watched the controlled chaos around him with unusual calm. While others panicked, he focused on the main view screen showing Jake carefully whittling a piece of wood into what appeared to be a comfortable chair. The human worked with patient concentration, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't building a defensive fortification or preparing for combat. He was making furniture for a campsite on a death world. The resolution formed in Vex's mind with quiet certainty. The most competent being he had ever encountered wasn't a weapons specialist or a survival expert. He was a literature major carving wood with a simple knife, treating a nightmare planet like a pleasant camping trip. Where others saw systemic failure, Vex saw possibility. The humans' approach suggested an entirely different philosophy of survival, one based on adaptation rather than confrontation, on understanding rather than domination. So the commander who had built his career on discipline and control found unexpected hope in the sight of someone making a chair. The panic around him represented the death of an old system, but Jake's calm craftsmanship hinted at what might replace it. Vex realized they hadn't failed the simulation. They'd finally found a better way to approach survival, even if that way involved learning from someone whose official qualifications included writing poetry essays and leading nature walks. The future of galactic survival training might look less like military doctrine and more like a well-organized camping trip. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify him. It gave him something resembling hope. The simulation's end date approached like a slow-moving administrative deadline. Across the observation decks and in the camps below, one thing became clear. The Academy's traditional metrics for success had fractured beyond recognition. For generations, survival had been measured in clean, quantifiable terms. The scoring system evaluated resource conservation, threat elimination, and structural integrity. Teams were judged on how efficiently they stretched their supplies, how thoroughly they neutralized environmental dangers, and how well their shelters adhered to approved defensive designs. Jake's team failed every conventional metric spectacularly. Their resource conservation score registered as disastrously low because they'd ignored their ration packs entirely, choosing instead to forage everything from the surrounding environment. Their threat elimination tally showed a perfect 0. They hadn't destroyed a single hostile plant or animal. Instead, they'd cooked them, dried them, or simply learned to live alongside them. Their structures earned technical violations for non-standard designs that used natural materials rather than approved construction methods. Yet the biological readings told a completely different story. The team's health markers showed optimal nutrition levels, better hydration than their ration-based counterparts, and stress indicators that suggested they'd spent 3 weeks at a wellness retreat rather than on a death world. They'd actually gained weight while other teams struggled with caloric deficits. Their mental state evaluations showed improved cooperation and problem-solving skills, rather than the expected trauma responses. They were healthy, well-fed, and psychologically sound, with Zara even noting she'd never slept better than in her leaf-insulated shelter. The tension between data and reality became impossible to ignore when compared with the other teams. Those who had followed Academy protocols to the letter now sat huddled in their failing shelters, exhausted and traumatized. Their ration packs were depleted, their energy shields flickering from power drain, their movements sluggish from constant vigilance. They'd eliminated threats but remained prisoners in their own camps, afraid to venture out for fear of what else the environment might throw at them. Their survival had been a battle of attrition, and they were losing. Jake's team had done the opposite. They'd expanded their territory each day, discovering new resources and improving their living conditions. They'd added furniture to their shelter, developed better cooking methods, and even started a small garden from seeds they'd collected. They treated Planet X7 less like a death world and more like a fixer-upper property with good potential. The simulation's parameters had no category for participants who not only survived, but actually enhanced their environment. The resolution arrived with quiet inevitability. The definition of success itself required complete revision, not just minor adjustments to the survival manuals. Success couldn't be measured in ration conservation if the environment provided better nutrition. Threat elimination became irrelevant if threats could be transformed into resources. Structural integrity meant little if non-standard designs worked better than approved models. The entire philosophy behind survival training needed to be rethought from the ground up, so the Academy found itself contemplating a new standard that looked suspiciously like what humans would call a successful weekend camping trip. Good food, comfortable shelter, pleasant surroundings, and everyone returning home healthy and relaxed. The metric shifted from how much danger they avoided to how well they lived within the environment. The goal became adaptation rather than domination, integration rather than separation. And the passing grade for survival would now include things like meal quality, sleep satisfaction, and mental well-being alongside the traditional measures of physical safety. The simulation hadn't been failed by Jake's team. It had been failed by its own limited definitions of what survival actually meant. The new success criteria would judge cadets on whether they could make themselves at home in hostile environments, rather than just endure them. The ultimate test became not whether they could defeat nature, but whether they could learn to live with it comfortably. The simulation ended with the same clinical precision it had begun, the extraction ships descending through X7's orange haze to collect the scattered cadets. The official results flashed across the Academy's main display with brutal clarity. Team after team registered as catastrophic failures, their vital signs showing varying degrees of physical depletion and psychological trauma. Their resource levels hovered near 0, their defensive systems were compromised, and their post-simulation debriefings revealed deeply ingrained fear responses to planetary environments. Then Jake's team appeared on the results board, their metrics glowing with a calm green that seemed almost insulting amidst the sea of red warning indicators. They were the only group not deemed a complete disaster, though the system struggled to classify what exactly they had achieved instead. The Academy leadership gathered in the secure briefing room, their carapaces and membranes displaying subtle signs of stress. The debate began immediately, voices overlapping with a rare lack of military decorum. One faction argued for complete data suppression, suggesting the simulation had been flawed or contaminated by some unknown variable. They pointed out the embarrassment of admitting their training had been objectively worse than one cadet's weekend camping experience. Another group proposed classifying Earth's actual capabilities as a sector-level security threat, arguing that any species this adaptable represented a potential danger to galactic stability. The discussion cycled through denial, fear, and institutional self-preservation, each option more desperate than the last. Commander Vex listened quietly throughout the arguments, his forearms crossed in what the staff recognized as his patient but unimpressed stance. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the anxiety with the clarity of someone who had already made up his mind. He argued for the opposite approach, not suppression or fear, but complete transparency and institutional humility. He suggested they embrace the failure as the most valuable learning opportunity the Academy had encountered in centuries. His point was simple. If their methods were wrong, they should learn the right ones rather than pretend the error didn't exist. He then proposed something so radical that the room fell silent. The first ever interstellar cultural exchange program focused specifically on outdoor education. Earth would be invited to send instructors, not military trainers or scientists, but what he called practical experience specialists. The Academy would send its best cadets to learn directly from humans in their native environment. The program would operate outside standard diplomatic channels, framed as an educational initiative rather than a military operation. The proposal included everything from language immersion to hands-on field exercises in various Earth environments. The tension in the room shifted from panic to pragmatic calculation as the implications became clear. This wasn't about admitting defeat, it was about acquiring superior knowledge. The goal would be to integrate Earth-style survival thinking into the core galactic curriculum, fundamentally changing how they approached hostile environments. The exchange would provide access to human methods without requiring them to admit how badly their own systems had failed. It was a diplomatic solution to an educational problem, wrapped in the respectable packaging of cultural sharing. The resolution came with the quiet clicking of approval stamps as the leadership team authorized the proposal. The documents would be forwarded to Earth through proper channels, the language carefully crafted to avoid any hint of desperation. The program outline mentioned mutual learning and cultural exchange, focusing on the benefits to both civilizations. It made no reference to the simulation results or the planetary reclassification, presenting the initiative as forward-thinking educational cooperation rather than emergency retraining. So the most advanced military force in the galaxy found itself preparing to enroll its best cadets in what amounted to an interstellar summer camp. The irony wasn't lost on the officers who would oversee the program's implementation. Their elite soldiers would be learning shelter construction from park rangers, plant identification from amateur naturalists, and fire-making from people who considered these skills recreational hobbies. The entire operation would have seemed absurd, if not for the overwhelming evidence that these methods actually worked, better than centuries of military research, and it had all started because one human cadet didn't panic when faced with a death world. Instead of following protocol or preparing for combat, Jake Morrison had treated the experience like a moderately challenging cooking project. His decision to make berry jam from pulsating alien fruits had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape interstellar relations and revolutionize survival training across multiple civilizations. The cultural exchange program represented the galaxy's awkward but determined first step toward acknowledging that sometimes the most advanced solution is also the simplest if you know how to look at the problem differently. Jake Morrison returned to Earth on a Tuesday afternoon, completely unaware that his name had become synonymous with survival across multiple star systems. The transport ship deposited him back at the Academy's Earth campus with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized his departure. He collected his personal effects from storage, signed the dismissal paperwork, and caught the public transit back to his apartment. By Wednesday morning, he was back at his part-time job as a park ranger assistant, leading school groups on nature walks and reminding people to stay on marked trails. Evenings found him in the local library, reading poetry collections and working on an essay about metaphorical language in post-apocalyptic fiction. The entire Death World simulation had already taken on the quality of a slightly strange dream, something that happened to someone else in another life. Meanwhile, light years away, his name was being etched into Academy halls with ceremonial precision. The Morrison scale now appeared in official documents as the standard measurement for planetary hostility levels. The Morrison method described survival techniques based on adaptation rather than confrontation. Cadets who had previously trained with weapons and defensive systems now found themselves learning to identify edible plants by scent and texture. Instructor manuals included new sections on recipe modification for alien ingredients and emergency cooking techniques. The changes filtered down through every level of training, transforming how the Academy approached survival education. The galaxy's perception of humanity underwent a fundamental shift. Instead of seeing humans as physically fragile primitives, civilizations now viewed them as resilient, adaptable, and utterly fearless when it came to culinary experimentation. The fact that humans would taste test unknown organisms became the stuff of legends. Their willingness to transform lethal environments into functional kitchens suggested either extraordinary bravery or complete insanity, depending on which xenopsychologist you asked. Planetary classification teams began including human dietary preferences in their assessment criteria, noting that any world humans found good for camping probably required immediate reclassification. The resolution of this strange cultural transformation became clear in hindsight. Humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wasn't a weapon or technology. It was effectively a cookbook, a collection of techniques for making hostile environments not just survivable but actually livable. The methods were simple, required minimal equipment, and could be adapted to virtually any planetary conditions. They represented knowledge accumulated through centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations not as military secrets but as practical life skills. So a literature, students' comm weekend in the woods, treating a death world like a slightly challenging camping trip, rewrote the book on survival for an entire galaxy. His approach demonstrated that sometimes the most advanced solution is also the simplest, provided you have the right perspective. The Academy's entire philosophy shifted from battling environments to understanding them, from elimination to integration, from fear to curiosity. The changes affected everything from first contact protocols to colonial settlement strategies, all because one human refused to panic when faced with the unknown. And it had all begun not with a dramatic battle or technological breakthrough, but with a single berry. That moment when Jake Morrison sniffed a pulsating alien fruit and declared it edible became the foundational story of a new approach to interstellar survival. The berry itself was eventually classified as mildly toxic, but easily neutralized through proper preparation, which somehow made the story even more representative of the human approach. They didn't avoid danger. They figured out how to make it safe through patience and technique. The legacy extended beyond survival training into broader cultural exchanges. Restaurants serving human-inspired cuisine appeared on planets that had never encountered Earth ingredients before. Cultural anthropologists studied human camping traditions as serious philosophical approaches to environmental interaction. The poet who had started it all remained completely unaware of his impact, concerned instead with whether it would rain during his next shift at the park, and if he should pack an extra jacket. The disconnect between his simple life and his galactic legacy created one of the more amusing cultural ironies in recent memory. Though Jake remained characteristically unconcerned about any of it, the galaxy thought it was testing a human. Instead, the human tested the galaxy and found it desperately unprepared. In that failure, they discovered a better way to survive. One where the most advanced technology is often a sharpened stick, and the deepest wisdom lies in knowing what's safe to eat. Maybe the real death world was the friends we made, but probably not. It was definitely Earth, so next time you're toasting marshmallows on a campfire, remember, you're not just making s'mores, you're practicing interstellar survival doctrine, one sticky finger at a time.